APUSH SPEEDRun review by me. Okay. Why does it exist? Because I think most people are retarded and you probably forgot 90% of the stuff you learned in AP US history, so I'm just going to do this as a quick reminder. Now, when it comes to studying American history, you should probably remember these 7 themes. I would say these are pretty good reference points for just remembering stuff. So that would be migration, expansion, settlement, role of government, society and culture, development of American identity, how the economy changed over time, America's role in the world, and politics. So, yeah, without further ado, let's go. So, let's do this quickly. So, Indians before European arrival, they populated the Americas. They were incredibly diverse, and their way of living was heavily based on geography. Many tribes made heavy use of maize, which allowed the shift from nomadic tribes to permanent agrarian society. When the Spanish Empire came with the discovery of the Americas by Christopher Columbus in 1492, the Spanish quickly conquered the Aztec and the Inca empires and established an empire in South America and parts of North America. Now, for life under Spanish rule, all you need to know is the encomienda and intermixing. Now, Columbian exchange was simply the exchange of goods, ideas, and crops, etc., between the Old and New World after 1492. So it's basically American crops help fuel the European population growth. Europe introduced things like horses and Christianity to the Americas. However, they also introduced a disease accidentally called smallpox, which decimated 90% of the Indian population because they did not have the antibodies to protect it. Also, another important thing to know about Spanish rule is the Pueblo Revolt. Now, simply, it was a revolt of the Pueblo people in New Mexico against Spanish rule due to them trying to forcibly convert them, and the rebellion sort of led to the Spanish to be more nicer to the Indians so they could better convert them. French versus British versus Spanish colonization. The British had various reasons for colonization. Some colonies were founded for religious reasons, others economic. Spanish were both economic and religious reasons. And the French and the Dutch, they were primarily economic, and they had very little interest in converting anybody. For the relationships with the Indians, the British had the worst relationship with the Indians. They wanted nothing to do with them. And they got into frequent wars with them. Examples being the Anglo-Powhatan War and Metacom's War. The Spanish had very mixed relationships with the Indians, sort of like half and half. The French and the Dutch had the best relationships with the Indians and often formed economic alliances with them so they could better obtain stuff like beaver fur. Now, for the differences between the the English colonies, New England was founded primarily for religious reasons and had a coastal, maritime, and trade-based economy. New England was also, in general, far more urbanized and had a colder climate. The middle colonies were the most religiously and ethnically diverse of the colonies, and it was also sort of like the breadbasket of the colonies. It had a mild climate. The southern colonies were large-scale plantation-based economies that grew cash crops like cotton and tobacco. The South also made heavy use of slavery, which we will get to momentarily, and also they had a very warm and fertile climate that supported the large-scale agricultural plantations. Now, for colonial self-governance, all you need to know is that the colonies had a history of governing themselves away from Britain. So examples of that would be the House of Burgesses, the Mayflower Compact, and town halls in New England. You also should know colonial resistance to British attempts to enforce their will in the colonies, such as resistance to mercantilism, so that would be the navigation laws. And you should also know about salutary neglect, which is basically the British sort of relaxing control on the colonies ever since when William I took power in a glorious revolution. Now, Bacon's rebellion, pretty much what you need to know is that it led to the decline of indentured servitude and the rise of slavery in the South. Also led to the race-based nature of slavery and the racial hierarchy that was created in the South. Now also you should know the influence of religion. So that would be John Winthrop's governance of New England, William Penn's founding of Pennsylvania, and the effects of the Great Awakening in cultivating an American identity and on religion in America. Now, Unit 1 and 2 need to know people. I would say the people I didn't already mention are, I would say the most important of these people are Bartolome de las Casas and Jonathan Edwards and George Whitefield. And I say John Peter Zenger. So, yeah, onwards to Unit 3. 7 Years' War, pretty much it was caused by French and British competition over the Ohio River Valley. The effects of the war is that the French left North America and the British gained control of North America. Or I should say the British gained control of North America. Let's not complicate things. Now, what you need to know for colonial grievances leading up to the Revolutionary War is the Proclamation of 1763. Pretty much, colonists could not settle beyond the Appalachian Mountains. Quartering Act forced colonists to house British troops. Stamp Act, Sugar Act, and Township Acts enacted a bunch of unpopular taxes on the colonies, which, led to the modicum no taxation without representation. Pretty much the colonists felt like the British had no right to tax them since they were not represented, and also the Boston Massacre, which was used as anti-British propaganda. The influence of the Enlightenment, pretty much know John Locke's social contract, the idea of natural rights, and how these Enlightenment ideals were reflected in the Declaration of Independence and Thomas Paine's common sense. Now, the Revolutionary War, you pretty much only need to know the effects of certain battles and their effects, right? So that would basically be the Battle of Lexington and Concord. It started the American Revolution. Battle of Bunker Hill. It was the colonial morale. The Battle of Long Island, which was the disastrous battle for Washington, and almost destroyed the Continental Army. The Battle of Trenton, which boosted colonial morale after a devastating loss at Long Island. The Battle of Saratoga, which served as a turning point where the Spanish, the French, and the Dutch would enter the war on the side of the colonies. The Battle of Yorktown, which ended the war, and the Treaty of Paris, where the British agreed to colonial independence. Now, for the Articles of Confederation, you need to know is that the first Constitution of the United States, its weaknesses were it gave too much power to the states. It did not provide for an executive branch or any national army. The legislative branch was relatively weak and ineffective due to requiring a supermajority to pass legislation. And you should know that it was Shays' Rebellion, which was an uprising of Massachusetts farmers, that basically led to the Constitutional Convention and basically the end of the Articles of Confederation. You should also know that about the Northwest Ordinance, which was pretty much the only good thing the Articles did, which was provide the criteria for a territory to enter the Union of the state, and also ban slavery in the Northwest. Now, for the Constitutional Convention itself, you pretty much need to know the New Jersey Plan and the Virginia Plan, which were combined in what was known as the Great Compromise, which basically I mean, I'm sorry, I'm saying basically too much. I'm a big dummy dum dum. The Great Compromise created the modern day Congress. You also have the executive and judicial branch, which was the executive branch controlled the military and had the power to veto, and the judicial branch dealt with laws dealt with like legal cases relating to the Constitution. So basically, what ended basically all three branches had checks and balances on each other to basically prevent one branch from becoming too powerful. Well, you should also know the Three-Fifths Compromise basically South wanted the incorporated slave population so it would gain more representation in the House. The North opposed this. This led to the Three-Fifths Compromise. It basically said 3/5 of of a state's slave population would be counted towards representation in the House. It also banned the importing of slaves after. Also, Congress agreed to ban the importing of slaves after 1807. So, Federalists versus Anti-Federalists. Pretty much, Federalists wanted to ratify the Constitution. Anti-Federalists did not. Anti-Federalists simply did not want to ratify it because it believed it did not go far enough to protect individual liberty. So, Federalists conceded and established a Bill of Rights containing the first 10 amendments. So that would be your freedom of speech, freedom to own guns, legal rights, etc. The presidency of George Washington, pretty much it set a lot of important precedents for U.S. history, economic policy. There was a lot of disputes between Alexander Hamilton and Thomas Jefferson. Jefferson disagreed with a lot of Hamilton's economic policy because he had strict constructionist views, which Jefferson had strict constructionist views while Hamilton had loose constructionist views, which, to put simply, strict constructionism is basically this idea that the government is only allowed to do what the Constitution says it can do, while loose constructionism is basically the opposite, saying that if the Constitution does not forbid it, therefore, the government can do it. So, yeah. For foreign policy, Washington basically chose to stay neutral in the French Revolution. There was also Washington also sent John Jay to basically make Jay's treaty with Britain. It was kind of controversial. Washington's decision to stay neutral in the French Revolution would basically, sort of set a precedent for American isolationism for at least the next century or so. The Whiskey Rebellion, Washington putting it down increased respect for the federal government. And remember Washington's farewell address. He warned against foreign alliances and foreign entanglements, sectionalism, and loyalty to political parties over the country. For the presidency of John Adams, pretty much you need to know the XYZ affair, the Alien Sedition Acts, and what it led to, which was the Kentucky and Virginia resolutions. And also the effects of the revolution on society and the world. You want to know it led to the abolition of slavery in the Northern states and inspired the French and Haitian revolutions, and it led to the creation of the idea of Republican motherhood, which was basically the first major concept of what women's role in American society would be, which was women should raise virtuous voting citizens, educated in republicanism. Republican motherhood also led to more women being educated on women having more opportunities in education, is what I should say. Now, need to know people, pretty much know these people. I've already mentioned most of these. Unit 4, need to know stuff. 1, presidency of Jefferson. He won against the incumbent president of Adams. His victory would be known as the Revolution of 1800 because it would basically be the end of Federalist power. Jefferson would oversee the purchase. Hang on, let me go back. So, the two things you want to know for Jefferson's presidency was that he oversaw the purchase of the Louisiana Territory, and he did so against his own strict constructionist principles. Jefferson would also ban trade with Britain and France in the Embargo Act due to them attacking neutral American merchant ships during the Napoleonic Wars. Now, the Embargo Act would significantly hurt the U.S. economy, and it actually went against Jefferson's own principles. So, that's pretty much what you should know. War of 1812, causation, war odds, British impressment, and trade disputes. Its effects was that it led to increased American nationalism and pretty much the end of the Federalist Party in any significant capacity. Also led to the era of good feelings, which was pretty much Democratic-Republican domination for over a decade. The Monroe Doctrine, it was issued by James Monroe, who was the 5th president, basically declared the Western Hemisphere as America's sphere of influence, and was the first major foreign policy of the U.S. Led to the market revolution. During the era of good feelings, there was the market revolution. Basically, it was a transformation of the American economy in the first half of the 19th century. The North America would switch to a system of mass production powered by machines and low-skilled laborers. New technologies were introduced, such as railroads, steamboats, and water-powered machines, etc. Now, just ignore this bullet point really because it's kind of inaccurate. The North became more industrialized, and the South became far more developed a far more agricultural, cash-based economy because of the cotton gin and other agricultural machines that sped up the process of making goods from cotton. So speaking of the differences between the North and the South, you have slavery and sexualism now. North and the South, we already mentioned it. North, more industrialized, had a higher population, mostly outlaw slavery. South, plantation-based agriculture, whose kind of entire economy depended on slavery. So you sort of when states were expanding westward and more states were entering the Union as free and slave states, there was basically this important balance in the Senate where there needed to be an equal amount of slave and free states, because if there was more free states or slave states, one side would have a bigger advantage in the Senate, which would lead to that side getting their laws and ideas passed more. So this was especially important for the slave states, as the North, since they had a higher population, had a higher representation in the House. So so a lot of slave states wanted the Senate was very important to slave states. So this basically this balance of free and slave states sort of led to the Missouri Compromise. Now, Missouri wanted to enter as a slave state. This would disrupt the balance of the Senate. So in the Missouri Compromise, Maine would become a free state, and basically it was agreed that a line would be drawn at the 3630, where all states above it couldn't allow slavery. All states below it could if they wanted to. Also, no Nat Turner's slave rebellion. It increased the fear of a slave uprising in the South. Now, on the economic side, you had Henry Clay's American System. It was basically a response to the Panic of 1819 and basically the War of 1812, exposing a lot of the weaknesses. Pretty much know that Henry Clay wanted to implement tariffs, reestablish the national bank, and fund internal improvements. The Panic of 1819, it was an economic recession caused by irresponsible banking practices and inflation. And its effects was that it led to increased demand for universal suffrage for white men, instead of just those who own land and pay taxes. So you have Andrew Jackson, and he initially lost in 1824 due to what his supporters called the corrupt bargain. Now, just to explain this simply, basically, Speaker of the House Henry Clay drew his support behind John Quincy Adams, who and basically declared him the winner in like the disputed presidential election of 1824. And then Quincy Adams made Clay his Secretary of State, which Jackson and his supporters called the corrupt bargain, because it was sort of alleged that there was like sort of like a backroom deal between them. Anyway, that didn't matter because Jackson won in a landslide in 1828, and he was basically known for being the people's candidate and basically appealing for the masses. He was basically a proto-populist. He expanded the powers of the president with his use of the veto. He vetoed the charter for the National Bank, killing it. Jackson was in comparison to like other presidents, vetoed pretty much anything he didn't like. So it basically set a precedent for the presidential use of the veto. You also have the nullification crisis, where South Carolina attempted to nullify the tariff abominations. They even dreaded secession. Jackson got the Force Act passed, so South Carolina would comply, but he also reduced the tariffs, so like they would appease South Carolina. Then you also have the Trail of Tears. Basically, Jackson passed the Indian Removal Act, which would remove like the Cherokee from their native homeland in Georgia. Cherokee sued in the case called Worcester versus Georgia, and despite the Supreme Court actually granting the victory to the Cherokee was still kind of forced off their land, where they agreed to settle in like a reservation, like west of the Mississippi, and federal troops forced any Cherokee who would not comply off the land in Georgia. Now basically the Cherokees' march west would basically be known as the Trail of Tears, and many Cherokee would die due to poor weather and lack of resources. Now pretty much Jackson's presidency saw the rise of the two-party system with the Whigs and the Democrats, and also Jackson's presidency also saw pretty much universal suffrage being granted to like pretty much all white men in America, right? So for Unit 4, what you need to know stuff. Second Great Awakening. It was a religious revival. It preached moral religion. It was a religious revival where a lot of shockingly a lot of diverse groups of people, like a lot of diverse groups, racially diverse groups of people, racially and gender and sexually diverse. That it was a religious revival where there were sermons with a lot of racially and a lot of racially diverse people and men and women would meet to be preached about. And the Second Great Awakening in general preached moral and societal reform, and also influenced the rise of various social movements in the U.S., such as the temperance movement, which was a movement of people against the drinking of alcohol. Mormonism also kind of appeared during this time. It was basically like a religious Christian separatist movement founded by Joseph Smith. And the Mormons moved westward to Utah and established the territory of Utah, which would later become the great state of Utah. You also had Transcendentalism, which was basically this movement preaching the power and the influence of nature in society. And it led to the creation of the Hudson River Art School, which depicted romanticized paintings of the American West and of the Hudson River Valley. Unit 4. For Unit 4, need to know stuff. Cult of domesticity was basically the idea that it's a woman's role to be a homemaker, and if it was a man's role to earn money for the family. This actually mainly applied only to the growing middle class and the upper class, because lower class women pretty much had to go work in factories in order to make money for their families. Abolitionism, it was a group of people who wanted to outlaw and abolish slavery for moral reasons. Um, it was helped popularized by people like William Lloyd Garrison in papers like the and like abolition newspapers like the Liberator, which helped promote like anti-slavery sentiments to like white people in the North. And Garrison efforts helped create the anti-slavery society, which gained massive traction in the North. For women's rights, you had the Seneca Falls Convention. Women wanted more legal rights, more legal and political rights, because during the Second Great Awakening, they started to get more politically involved in movements. So this led to the Declaration of Sentiments, which basically called for women's equality and education, legal rights, and suffrage. For immigration, you had immigration waves from Ireland and Germany during like the 1840s and the 1850s to the U.S. The Irish predominantly moved to escape a potato famine, which was killing a lot of people. Germans moved to escape political unrest in the German states. And nativists, which were basically people who believed that we should act in the interests of the native white Anglo-Saxon population, or WASP for short, basically post-immigration. They believed that that the Irish would ruin American culture, and they also despised the fact that the Irish were Catholics. So many of these immigrants moved to cities on the coast, such as New York and Boston, and especially the Irish. They moved to Boston, and they opened up Catholic churches and schools for them. And the Irish opened up the Catholic churches and schools for themselves. Now, there's this video which is basically like a clip from the gangs in New York. Should probably warn, it has the hard R in it at the beginning of the video, but I think it does a pretty much good example of explaining what nativism is. So yeah. For uniform need to know people, pretty much know John Marshall, pretty much know all of these people because they're pretty much very important. Unified need to know stuff. Manifest Destiny. The idea now, Manifest Destiny is that it was the destiny of Americans to settle in the continent of North America, and they basically said fuck you to all the Indians. And the Mexicans. Speaking of which, the Mexican-American War, U.S. won the war easily, and they gained the territories of the modern U.S. Southwest. So that would be California, Arizona, Nevada, New Mexico, etc. U.S. also got the Oregon Territory with Britain, which was basically most of the U.S. Northwest, and in exchange for settling the border at the 49th parallel, which was basically the modern U.S.-Canadian border. Now, for slavery, you had the Free Soil Movement, which basically opposed the expansion of slavery in the West. Now, these people, they really didn't give a shit about black slaves. They mainly did not want to compete with enslaved laborers. Now, for events leading up to the Civil War, you pretty much need to know the Compromise of 1850, bleeding Kansas, and popular sovereignty, the raid on Harper's Ferry, the refusal to enforce the fugitive slave law in the North, the Dred Scott case, which we will talk about later, and the rise of the Republican Party in the North, the election of Lincoln in 1816, which triggered the secession crisis, the bombing of Fort Sumter that started the war, and you should also know the Confederacy pretty much made it of these predominantly of made out of these southern states, and they mainly succeeded due to the issue of slavery. Civil War, important battles of knowledge. Pretty much know the Anaconda Plan, which was the Union plan to win the war. You should know that the South did a lot better in the early stages of the war because the North was just fucking incompetent as hell. Jesus Christ, you should read about George Clemens. Hang on. Samuel Clemens, yeah, that's his name. You should read about Samuel Clemens and how bloody fucking incompetent he was. for the important battles, you should know the Battle of Antietam, the Battle of Gettysburg, which was the turning point of the war, the Battle of Gettysburg and the capturing Vicksburg, which was basically the turning point of the war. Sherman's policy of total war, which was basically Sherman's scorched earth policy that he enacted in his march through Georgia, and the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, which ended the Civil War. The home fronts during the Civil War, Union. Now, for the Union side, Lincoln suspended habeas corpus, which to arrest Southern sympathizers. This decision was pretty controversial among Northern newspapers. Lincoln was also allowed black men to enlist in the Union Army, mainly due to the efforts of Frederick Douglass, he was a prominent black abolitionist during this time. These black soldiers made up 10% of the Union Army by the end of the war. However, they were pretty discriminated against in terms of pay and could not achieve a higher military rank than captain. The Emancipation Proclamation, basically Lincoln issued his proclamation declaring that all slaves in the seceding states were free. Now, it's pretty much important to know that this actually did not free any slaves, and Lincoln pretty much mainly issued this to prevent European intervention in the Civil War, for optics reasons. And you have the draft riots, which were riots in New York City caused by people not wanting to fight for slaves in the South and rich people paying people to fight in their place. These riots killed upwards of 1,200 people, many of whom were targeted African Americans, and the riots had to be put down by the U.S. military. For the Confederacy, it's pretty much a lot simpler. Naval blockade hurt the Southern economy, and a lot of farmland was ruined by the war. This led to food shortages that led to riots across Southern cities. Now, onwards to Reconstruction. Now, for Reconstruction, you should pretty much just note Lincoln's and Johnson's 10% plan versus the radical Republicans. Lincoln and Johnson's plan, the radical Republicans wanted to punish the South more, while Lincoln and Johnson had a much more softer approach to the South. The radical Republicans pretty much took control of Reconstruction after the election, after Ulysses S. Grant became president. And the radical Republicans pretty much took control of Reconstruction, and they passed the Reconstruction Act that divided the South into military occupation zones. The radical Republicans also got the 13, 14, and 15 amendments passed. 13 banned slavery. The 14 gave birthright citizenship, and the 15 gave voting rights. These amendments were designed to protect the rights of the African American population from discrimination. I also forgot to mention, but you should also know the Freedmen's Bureau, which was designed to basically help former slaves in the South. However, the efforts of Reconstruction would be met with immense backlash in the South. The South passed many measures to resist Reconstruction efforts. These included poll tests and pretty difficult tests to basically prevent, black people from voting. White supremacist groups like the KKK terrorized black people in the South, and black people were often trapped in a cycle of poverty by sharecropping and tenant farming. Now, for the election of 1876 and the Compromise of 1877, pretty much all you need to know is that it ended the era of Reconstruction in the South. So, pretty much know these important people for the Civil War. For Unit 5, and let's move on to Unit 6. Holy shit, I actually forgot. Unit 6, you should know that westward expansion was encouraged by the Transcontinental Railroad, Homesteaders Act, Manifest, and the idea Manifest Destiny. The Transcontinental Railroad made westward travel a lot easier. Homesteaders Act basically gave free land to anyone who could settle the land. And westward expansion would also cause a lot of problems with the Indians, which would lead to the massacre in Wounded Knee, the Black Hills and the Sioux War massacre, the Sand Creek massacre, and you would have attempts to assimilate the Native Americans, such as the boarding school and the Dawes Act. Also, the industrialization of American society pretty much causes Bezimir's hypothesis, electricity, railroads, affects the massive urbanization and expansion of American cities, rising monopolies. America became an industrial power and development of new industries and the growing economy. New South pretty much just refers to the South passing Jim Crow segregation laws, and also the South preventing African Americans from voting by enacting poll taxes, making them very difficult to test. Plessy v. Ferguson upheld Southern segregation laws, but established the doctrine of separate but equal. This would pretty much be like the law until the Brown versus Board of Education. Now, because of racial discrimination and racial terrorism against black people started to flee for a better life in the West and later in the North. Now, Unit 6 also deals with the captain industries, or the robber barons. So that would be the two most important people would be John D. Rockefeller and Andrew Carnegie. Both use horizontal integration and vertical integration to basically establish large-scale monopolies in their respective industries. Rockefeller used horizontal integration, which is more simply is basically is when a company basically buys out all rival companies, basically creating this giant company with no corporation. Rockefeller owned 90% of the oil. Rockefeller's company, Standard Oil, owned like 90% of the oil industry using this method. Carnegie used vertical integration, which is sort of like Carnegie bought out all of the supply chain companies, so he could basically controls the entire process of steel production in the country. Now, part of the reason why these monopolies were allowed to exist was due to the laissez-faire policies, and also the concept of social Darwinism. Also, the concept of social Darwinism being applied to the economy. However, it should also be important to note that despite Carnegie and Rockefeller using pretty shady methods to in their business practices, such as using women, children, and immigrants because they could be paid less than a man, and also creating monopolies. Both of them were philanthropists who believed it was basically the duty of rich people to give their wealth to the poor, to basically give their wealth back to society. So they gave hundreds of millions of dollars of wealth to build libraries, schools, universities, theater halls, etc. So, rise of unions. Unions rose to address and combat poor working conditions and low wages. The unions achieved their goals by using collective bargaining strikes, slowing the production and political action. Example of union action would be the Great Railroad Strike of 1877 and the Pullman Strike. What you should know is that both of these strikes kind of resulted in a lot of death, and it resulted in the U.S. military intervening in the side of the businessmen, because these railroad strikes were disrupting the U.S. economy. Union organizations, pretty much the two prominent organizations you should probably know are the Knights of Labor and the American Federation of Labor. Also know the Sherman Antitrust Act, which was passed in 1890 against large-scale monopolies. However, would not be used in any significant capacity until the presidency of Theodore Roosevelt and the Progressive Movement. The immigration and migration. Immigrants came to the United States from all over Europe. especially Eastern Europe, Italy, Ireland, and Scandinavia. You should know the push and pull factors for them, mainly poverty in Europe, sometimes persecution. Pull factors, better economic opportunities in America, and also there was more liberty and freedom in America in comparison to Europe. Immigrants mainly moved to the large industrial cities where they made up the urban poor and lower classes. They lived in dirty, cramped tenements, and they took on pretty dangerous and unsanitary jobs in order to earn money for their families. Some immigrants brought aspects of their culture to the U.S. and lived in the ethnic enclave. So you had things like Little Italy and like Chinatown popping up. And on the West Coast, many Chinese people moved to America. Now, it's just really important to know is that Chinese and Irish immigrants helped in large part build the U.S. Transcontinental Railroad, and by 1870, 50,000 Chinese people on the lived on the west coast of the United States. Now, for internal migration, you had like exodusters, African Americans who moved from the south to escape racial violence and discrimination to the west, and rich people moved out of the cities, pretty much leaving the cities inhabited by the middle class and the urban poor. Now, nativist resistance to the immigration. Again, we can just sum this up pretty quickly. Nativists believe foreign immigrants, especially Catholic immigrants, especially non-white and Catholic immigrants, would destroy white Anglo-Saxon Protestant culture. And they also believe, they would take their jobs due to them, and oftentimes working for lower wages. So this basically led to the Chinese Exclusion Act, which basically banned all Chinese immigration due to the fact that the Chinese were accused of driving wages down due to being willing to work for less. And however, you also had some people like Jane Addams who wanted to help poor immigrants and thus established settlement houses which helped poor immigrants out, especially in Chicago. Actually, they were in Chicago, correction on my part. But for the middle class, you had the rise of white collar jobs, which basically influenced the middle class. You also had many women entering the labor force for the first time as typewriters and teachers. Many women adopted white collar jobs, and this was pretty much the first significant. And this was basically actually scratch that. Never mind. Forget what I just said. All right, many women entered the labor force as typewriters and teachers, but also unskilled laborers in factories. The middle class had excess income, however, did not have enough to be considered upper class. So that's basically what made them middle class. Sort of in between upper and lower classes. The rise in the middle class also saw the rise of leisure activities. So you saw the rise of amusement parks, circuses, and sports like baseball and football. Now, reform in society, pretty much the social gospel. Some Americans turning to socialism to solve, in response to the problems of industrial capitalism. The Granger laws and movement, which were in large part a response to corruption by the railroads, and also was served as a prelude to the Populist Party. NASA, National American Women's Suffrage Association, and the Women's Suffrage, the Women's Christian Temperance Union, which was one of the first which NASA and the WCTU were basically the first major examples of women start becoming more and more involved into politics. And the Anti-Saloon League, of course, you sort of had Wayne Wheeler basically saying, campaigning then to get rid of alcohol. And you also know the economic panics. You know, they had Panic of 1877 and Panic of 1898 basically created greater divide between the upper and lower classes. Know the Populist Party platform, which was adopted, which much of it would be adopted by the Democratic Party in an 1896 election, especially by William Jennings Bryan's, with many of the populist ideas being expressed in the Cross Gold speech. And the Populist Party served as prelude to the rise of the progressive movement in many ways, and many of the populist's goals would be passed in the progressive movement. So, last thing you pretty much need to know is political halls for Unit 6. The last thing you need to know are political halls, which were groups of people who basically like did a bunch of stuff to secure votes. So example of would be like Tammany Hall, where they organized the needs of communities so everyone would flourish. This would basically put the communities in debt to them, so and thus basically the communities would all like tammany their votes. So and the hall and basically the head of this was William Tweed, okay, was basically the head of Tammany Hall and basically stole millions of taxpayer dollars. Now, how Tammany Hall got votes was basically they gave like a benefit. They basically gave jobs to immigrants, so they got their votes. They would basically split parties in halves. They would basically split party ballots in half so that, you know, they could win elections. You know, it's a bunch of crazy shit like that. But, you know, pretty much all you just need to know that is that these political laws were corrupt as hell. Now, onwards to Unit 7, for Unit 6, before that, Unit 6 important people, you should know pretty much the captains of industry like Carnegie and Rockefeller, people invented important shit like Bessemer, Graham, and Edison. Eugene V. Debs, union leader. You should also know like African American educational advocates such as Washington and Webb Du Bois, you know, and their differences. Ada Tarbell, who was like actually, never mind. This is completely wrong. I got this confused with another woman, so completely scratched it. Susan B. Anthony was a feminist who founded NASA, and William Jennings Bryan, who was the Democratic nominee in 1896, who adopted the populist platform. Unit 7 need to know stuff. Now, for imperialism, pretty much just know the motivations for imperialism. Also know like the reasons why know the motivations for anti-imperialists, which was mainly like they thought it was hypocritical for the U.S. to engage in imperialism, despite the fact that it sort of arose as a nation. It was a nation founded in a revolution against an empire, and also they didn't want to deal with the hassle of incorporating a bunch of brown and minorities, a bunch of minorities into America. So the imperialists sort of got their wish with the Spanish-American War. Now, the war was primarily caused by yellow journalism by people like John Pfizer, Pfizer. I don't know how to pronounce his name, but he and he and a lot of other people engaged in yellow journalism, you know, to sell more papers. And yellow journalism exaggerated war crimes the Spanish committed against Cuba. And also you had the U.S.'s main incident, which was blamed on Spain. Now, America easily won this war, and its effects would be America's influence in world politics increased a lot as they gained much of the former Spanish territories. And also, America's historical policy switched from isolationism, and also this would be the beginning of the end of America's historic policy of isolationism and the beginning of a switch to a much more interventionist one. You also had other examples of U.S. imperialism, such as the annexation of Hawaii. If you want an earlier example of U.S. imperialism, it would be like, the U.S. forcibly opening up Japan in 1850, and also be the Filipino-American War. So to continue, the progressive movement, it was basically a movement that rose in like the 1890s, in the late. It was a movement that arose in the late 19th century to early 20th century, and they wanted to solve societal ills and problems by reforming government and society. Now, in general, you should pretty much know like what the progressives in general supported, such as regulating business practices, ensuring working conditions, expanding democracy, and especially trust busting monopolies and major corporations like Standard Oil. Now the progressives, not the federalists. Sorry, the progressive would achieve many of this, such as breaking up monopolies by the Shermans and the Anti-Sherman Act, the passage of the 16, 17, 19 amendments. 16 established a federal income tax, 17 was direct election of senators, and 19 was the women's suffrage. And they also achieved economic and workplace reforms, such as the abolition of labor and better and safer working conditions. They also, this isn't everything, but like this is pretty much like the very important shit. So let's move on. For the progressive presidents, you have Roosevelt, William Howard Taft, and Woodrow Wilson. For Roosevelt, you should know pretty much the Panama Canal, and like Roosevelt's more interventionist foreign policy. Roosevelt's build up in the Navy, sort of the whole idea of speak softly and carry a big stick. U.S. conservation efforts that started under Roosevelt, so that would be your national parks. And the Roosevelt Coordinate, which is basically the Monroe Doctrine 2.0, and Roosevelt's Square Deal platform. I should also mention, like, under Roosevelt, there was a lot of trust busting of corporations. And in fact, under all three progressive presidents, there was a bunch of presidents. For Taft, pretty much you just only need to know the dollar diplomacy. The Payne-Aldrich Act, which sort of divided the Republican Party, which led to Wilson's landslide victory in the election of 1912 due to Republicans being divided between Roosevelt running again and Taft. Now, Wilson, you should know his moral diplomacy and his foreign policy, which was very interventionist, such as the occupation of Veracruz. You should know Wilson's initial attempt but contrary to Wilson's normal sort of interventionist foreign policy, he wanted to stay neutral in World War I, although he did heavily lean towards the Allies. But after World War I, Wilson established the 14 points, which was to prevent basically World War I from happening. Like another World War I happening again, but how happening again by basically establishing more openness between nations in terms of trade and alliances. You had the midterms of 1918, which basically prevented the U.S. into the League of Nations, and World War I, just to go over the causes, it was caused by European ethnic nationalism and European militarism, competing foreign interests of European empires, and a system of alliances between nation states that forced nations into war when one nation declared war on another. Now, U.S. entry in the war. The U.S. had been supporting the Allies by providing weapons and arms to them, but however, they were officially neutral and wanted to stay out of the fighting. However, because of the Zimmerman telegram sent by Germany, which encouraged Mexico to invade the U.S. entered the war in 1917. And the effects of the war for America was that the U.S. influence over global politics and was that U.S. politics over global influence over global politics increased, and U.S. entered a golden age known as the Roaring '20s due to being relatively unaffected by the war, or compared to Europe. Units now for the home front, pretty much you just need to know Wilson established the draft, which put a lot of fighting age American men into the war. Some people protested the draft in the war. This led to the Sedition Act of 1918, which made it illegal to publish or convey information or opinions against the war effort. Wilson also established the War Industry Boards, which basically coordinated the production of war supplies such as guns and ammunition. And also, women took on some of the roles of men who went on to fight the war, such as manufacturing and agricultural positions. You also had the Spanish flu, which killed 675,000 people, and the government censored information about the disease because they wanted to prevent Americans from becoming demoralized from the war effort. Now, for the immediate aftermath of the war, the Red Scare, the first Red Scare at least, was caused by the Russian Revolution, which led to a fear of communism in the U.S. East led to the Palmer raids, where suspected communists and anarchists were arrested, and a lot of them were deported from the U.S., which based. But anyway, moving on. Immigration and internal migration. The Immigration Act of 1924 heavily restricted immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe and banned all immigration from Asia. And also you had the Great Black Migration, which was an exodus of black African Americans from the South and northern cities. Now, for culture during the cities, you should know that America was experiencing an economic boom. A lot more people had excess income to spend on things. So, they bought new products such as the Ford automobile, radios, etc. And companies marketed these things by using advertising to pressurize Americans into buying stuff. There was also popular music, which was jazz, which was heavily inspired by African American music. 1920s also saw the rise of cinema, with Americans watching movies often. And the 20s were dominated by three Republican presidents, which you should know as Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover. For Prohibition, you should know it was created by the 18th Amendment and the Volstead Act, which had outlawed alcohol. Now, the effects was that Americans found ways to get around the law, both legal and illegal. These included basically some clubs would stock up on alcohol before the ban went into effect, which lasted them through Prohibition. Some people obtained alcohol through legal loopholes, such as religious or medical loopholes. Some people went so far to create their own alcohol, which was known as moonshine. And fun fact, the federal government would basically put a lot of toxic shit in moonshine, which led to the end, which led to a lot of people dying from sickness, and also the Prohibition led to the rise of the mafia and gangs that fought over alcohol. Probably the most infamous of which was Al Capone, who was the head of the Southwest Gang in Chicago, who kept a very high profile despite his criminal activities. Now, for black culture, the Harlem Renaissance, which was basically a revival of black culture in terms of the arts and intellectual pursuits. Black musicians basically created jazz musician, and black writers would write about the African American experience. Women, they entered jobs such as nursing and teaching, and also worked as unskilled labor. Ignore my shitty misspellings. Flappers. These were women who wore more revealing dresses, and they also cut their hair short. And also, you had, this is not relating to women, I just accidentally put it on here. The Lost Generation, these were writers who wrote about materialism and the waste of life in World War One. And now on to the Great Depression. Now, Great Depression was massive stock market crash in the United States in October 2019. It was caused by overspeculation, excess production, and people not being able to pay back loans and taking too much debt. Its effects were poverty and homelessness rose dramatically, and the Americans were forced in shithole shanty towns. Prohibition was ended. FDR was elected in a massive landslide in 1932, and the beginning of the massive expansion of the federal government under Roosevelt. Now, speaking of which, Roosevelt's New Deal, pretty much it was Roosevelt's plan to deal with the Depression. You pretty much need to know Roosevelt's relief for the unemployed, recovery for business, reform for economic institutions, relief for the unemployed. Pretty much know Roosevelt's agencies designed to create jobs for Americans. Recovery for business. Know the National Industrial Recovery Act. Know the reform of economic institutions. So that would be the Glass-Steagall Act, which regulated banks, and the Securities and Exchange Commission, which regulated the stock market. And also know, arguably the most important part of FDR's New Deal was Social Security, which was a system that gave senior citizens a stable form of a stable income from the government. And in civil, it basically bolstered the American economy and also massively expanded the federal government. So backlash to the New Deal. So liberals, they felt like the New Deal did not go far enough in some aspects. Conservatives, they believed that it was government overreach, and they brought parts of the New Deal to the Supreme Court, which led to the Supreme Court overruling some aspects of the New Deal. Roosevelt wanted to pack the court with justices sympathetic with his ideals. However, he was prevented by the Democrats and the Republicans, who believed it was unconstitutional. Now, there's this entire section about the effectiveness of the New Deal debate. You should probably know it just in case, because you might actually, because I'm pretty sure there was, I remember reading like an essay prompt about like evaluate the extent to which like the New Deal was effective in helping the Americas. So just know like the debate around like the effectiveness of the New Deal, and know the arguments for both sides. So yeah, World War II, America kind of returned to its isolationism after World War II. America sort of had a difficulty maintaining isolation due to the rise of totalitarian regimes in Germany, sort of the Nazis' rise, and Adolf Hitler and the Nazis' rise in Germany, and growing aggression from the Japanese Empire in the East, which made isolationism very difficult. When World War II broke out with the German Soviet invasion of Poland, America wanted to stay out of the war. There was basically this kind of a debate about whether or not Americans should get involved in the wars. You should know both sides. FDR, he sort of supported a sort of light interventionism, where Americans sort of intervened in the war, but not really. It was sort of like Americans gave a bunch of weapons and shit at the Great Britain during the war under the Cash and Carry program and the Lend-Lease Act. It would be the bombing of Pearl Harbor by the Japanese that would cause the U.S. to enter World War II. So remember that. For the U.S. home front, similar to World War One, FDR established the War Production Board and the Office of War Mobilization, which oversaw the production of war products such as, the shit that makes people blow up. They also commandeered private industries such as the automobile industry for wartime production. For labor, the U.S. had a labor shortage due to many men being sent to fight in Europe and the Pacific Theater. The U.S., like in World War I, also relied on women to start. Not like World War. The U.S. relied on women to start producing military goods and ammunition in place of the men, due to most of them being sent to fight war. Also, in terms of the economy, World War II sort of massively bolstered the American economy. Massively bolstered the American economy due to the demand for war jobs and the production of war goods, and this got America out of the Depression. Now, black men, you should know that they joined the war to help, to not only help aid the war effort, but also fight against racism. Now, they believe the logic was that if the nation saw the bravery of black soldiers, more black people would have more respect, and there would be more sympathy for civil rights. And you had the Japanese internment, and the black men, they were so segregated and discriminated against in World War One. And both World Wars actually, but segregation ended after the war, during the Korean War. Now, for the Japanese internment camps, government feared that Japanese people could have been spies. So FDR issued Executive Order 9066. You could sort of remember Order 66, which forced over 100,000 Japanese people in internment camps out of fear of espionage. Now, remember Korematsu versus the United States? It's sort of it was a case where a Japanese American citizen named Fred Korematsu sued, claiming that internment was a violation of his civil liberties. However, the Supreme Court ruled that internment was constitutional, as it was done under the guise of preventing espionage or sabotage during a time of war. So, what you need to know for America during the war was many saw the war as a war against. Many saw the war as one against totalitarianism, specifically not Nazi and fascist totalitarianism. This sentiments was reflective in FDR's For Freedom speech, which is something you should know. The plan was let's focus on Europe first and then Japan. So in the European theater, the U.S. Basically liberated France and defeated the Germans at the Battle of the Bulge. In the Pacific theater, the U.S. ended the war, World War II, by making the controversial decision to drop 2 nukes on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, which the morality of the bombings are still pretty hotly debated today. And as a side note, as a pretty important news, you should probably know the Axis war crimes. Germany, the Nazis systematically killed millions of Jews, Slavs, and other ethnic groups in what was known as the Holocaust. And Japan, you should know the rape of Nanking, where the Japanese brutally murdered and raped a lot of people in Nanking. And for the record, if you have a good stomach, I would recommend, and you want to look up a lot of the other shit the Japanese did, which is, I'm just gonna warn you, pretty like fucked up shit, like beyond fucked up shit. Like I'm just putting it mild. When I say they committed like crimes beyond worse than crime, they their crimes against humanity, like made the Nazis these crimes against humanity were look like, I don't know, they were like sending Jews to like daytime therapy or whatever. Like that's how fucked up they were. So yeah, go research that at your own peril. But moving on, Unit 7 need to know people. Pretty much you want to know like the major presidents, what they did during this time, major political figures, major political figures such as Cabot Lodge. You should know some you should know some progressive activists such as Edith Tarbell and Upton Sinclair. Pretty much know like these foreign leaders, especially during World War II. No, Dwight D. Eisenhower and Douglas MacArthur. Eisenhower led forces in Europe. MacArthur led forces in the Pacific. And yeah, so moving on to Unit 8 because I'm tired as hell. So we're just gonna do a speed review. Because it is I am recording this at 1 o'clock, by the way. So you want to know the causes and effects of the Vietnam War and the Korean War. So and this was basically caused by the Truman Doctrine, which was the idea that we must prevent the spread of communism throughout the world. The Cuban Missile Crisis, which almost made the world go boom boom 60 years ago. The culture of conformity during the 60s, what caused it and the effects, as well as the rise of the counterculture. McCarthyism and the Red Scare, the sexual revolution and its consequences, which have been a disaster for the human race. So you got Venom Mystique, Roe v. Wade, and Griswold v. Connecticut. You got the Civil Rights Movement, so you got important people like Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks. You should probably know the difference between the radical moderate wings of the movement. The Civil Rights Act, the Black Panthers, the Nation of Islam, and Malcolm X. Brown versus the Board of Education, which ended segregation in schools. The rise of conservatism, which was like mainly like a result of the rise of evangelicalism and sort of the response to the sexual revolution and the increasing social liberalization of America. Also know Johnson's Great Society programs, which would be the War on Poverty, Medicare, Medicaid, and the welfare state, and also know the presidency of Carter, which would be the weak economy caused by stagflation and the Iran crisis. You sort of want to know like all these important figures. Know Joseph McCarthy, which was basically the guy who said, "You're a communist. You're a communist. You're a communist." Joseph Stalin and Mao Zedong, they were pretty big communist leaders. Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, Malcolm X, they were prominent civil rights leaders. Luther King was a much more moderate who advocated for peaceful action to achieve peaceful goals. Malcolm X was much more radical. He preached back black nationalism and separation. John F. Kennedy, he was famous for his support of civil rights, the Cuban Missile Crisis, and sort of having his brain recomposed by Lee Harvey Oswald. Betty Freeman, she was the feminist bitch who wrote The Feminine Mystique. Lyndon B. Johnson, he was 36th President of the United States, famous for his Great Society program and entering the war in Vietnam. Richard Nixon, he got the war out of Vietnam and resigned for his Watergate scandal. Jimmy Carter, he was famous for a disastrous economy in the Iran hostage situation. And Billy Graham, he was evangelical preacher who spread evangelicalism across the country. Now, you had a nice speed review. We're going to just do this quickly. No, the Reagan presidency and the Reagan Revolution. So, sort of no, like, Reagan's supply side economics and fiscal conservatism, which was basically if we reduce taxes and regulations, therefore the economy grows and therefore everyone benefits. And he was a hardliner against communism. No, the fall of the Soviet Union and the rise of America as the world's dominant superpower. Mikhail Gorbachev reforms led to the collapse of the Soviet Union. And Bush's New World Order and the protection of democracy, which was basically the idea that it was America's duty to protect democracy across the world. And the presidency of Bill Clinton, I did not have sexual relationships with that woman, and the midterms of 1994 and his impeachment because of that. The George W. Bush election and presidency, 1911, the war in Iraq, the Patriot Act, and the Afghanistan war. The Obama presidency, which was Obamacare, the rise of the Tea Party in 2010, and the Iran nuclear deal. Sort of extra, but just good to know. You know, the presidency of Donald Trump from 2017 to 2019, the Trump Revolution, so that would be the shift from the G-place shift towards a more economically populist working class party. And if you want more information, just remember the last few years of politics. So for legal cases, you pretty much you only need to worry about legal cases after Unit 4, so that would basically be, because that's pretty much when the Supreme Court started getting into action. So you would have Marbury versus Madison, so that established the principle of judicial review. Gibson versus Ogden established federal control of interstate commerce, and McCullough versus Maryland. It established federal supremacy over states, and also you have Worcester versus Georgia, which established Indian tribes as independent nations, not subject to government law, but that didn't stop them from getting BTFO by Andrew Jackson. Unit 5, you had the Dred Scott versus Stanford case. So Dred Scott was basically a slave who was brought to the free state of Illinois. Scott sued and argued that since he was in a free state, therefore he should be free. The court ruled that because Dred Scott was black, he could not sue for his freedom because African Americans could not be used as citizens and therefore had no legal right to sue. Okay. Slave owners had the right to bring their slaves anywhere under property rights, and the Dred Scott ruling effectively upheld slavery in the country. Plessy v. Ferguson, there was this. Okay, so what happened was there was a guy called Homer Plessy. He was a mixed race Creole. He attempted to sit in a white only court in New Orleans and was promptly kicked out. He sued, basically claiming Jim Crow laws violated his rights. The court ruled that segregation was legal as long as the segregated facilities were quote-unquote equal, and this established the principle of separate but equal, which would be the dominant law until the Brown versus Board of Education. For Unit 7, no Korematsu versus the United States. Again, we've already explained that, so I'm not going to go. So what you just simply need to know is that the court ruled that internment was constitutional, and it was to prevent espionage and sabotage during a time of war. The Supreme Court also ruled parts of the New Deal unconstitutional during this area. So that was so also know that you also had Unit 8, you had Loving versus Virginia, which legalized interracial marriage. You had Brown versus the Board of Education, which desegregated schools across the United States, which was a major victory for the civil rights movement. You had Griswold versus Connecticut, which legalized birth control under a right to privacy not found anywhere in the Constitution. And you had Roe versus Wade, which forced states to legalize abortion until Dobbs v. Jackson 2022. Unit 9, you had Gore versus Bush, which declared Bush the winner of the 2000 election, and you had Obergefell versus Hodge, which legalized gay marriage across the United States. And
Why is this all shut up? Come to bed. Come to bed, man. It's 1 o'clock. You need to sleep, Sanjay.
Hey, I will just. Gore versus. Okay, so, yeah, that's pretty much it. So, to conclude, yeah, that's. I hope my, review helped, my APUSH retard review help some of you out. Now, just for some general advice, get a good night's sleep. Don't stress too much about the exam and don't overthink about it. If you get if you don't get a good grade on the exam, like maybe you get a 2 or God forbid you get a 1 on the exam, don't fret too much about it. You're so important and valuable human being. I would recommend getting a good night's sleep before the exam, and I would recommend, like, before you take the exam, like waking up like 2 to 3 hours before it, taking a nice cold shower. I would recommend also eating a nice meaty breakfast with coffee, because coffee wakes you up, and also again pray to God that you do good on the exam. Now, thank you for listening to my retard review, and I'm out.